Thank you. Tere õhtust kõigile. Good evening, dear friends, dear colleagues. I am happy to be here, and our session will be the last obstacle between hard work and dinner. But let's enjoy our session. And actually, we discussed with Kerttu and with Theo that our session titled Education, Multilingualism in Education, it deals with the same question as the other presentation during our whole day here. But unfortunately, we only have two presentations during our session here. One presentation about primary education and the second presentation about university level education. Okay, but at least education both. The both multilingualism issues, the language policy issues in school and in university, they are really hot topics in nowadays Estonian discourse. And I'm sure we will be actively discussed the both our schooling here. We have double school system, as you know, how we can preserve our 200 languages in our school system, but to get very good Estonian as official language, as a state language knowledge on one side, and on other hand, how we can preserve sustainability, vitality of Estonian language as a language of higher education. The both are very hot topics in nowadays in Estonia, but I'm sure in other countries as well. So I'm very glad to introduce Professor Theo Marinis. Theo is Professor of Multilingualism at the University of Konstanz and at the University of Reading. And his research focuses on language acquisition and processing across populations of typically and atypically developing learners, and aims to uncover the nature of language processing in typical and untypical language development. He currently leads the EU project, the Multilingual Mind, that conducts multidisciplinary research and provides training on multilingualism to early-stage researchers in Europe. He's director, the Center for Multilingualism at the University of Konstanz, that coordinates research and organizes transfer activities on language and multilingualism to professionals and the general public. He has published his research widely in international journals and books. The title of Professor Marinis' presentation is Multilingualism in Education, Policy, Threats and Opportunities. And Professor Marinis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I was in Tallinn about 15 years ago. And I arrived last night, so I haven't seen anything, but I'm looking forward to see a little bit more tomorrow because it's a beautiful city. So I'm going to pick up several of the issues that were discussed in the morning. And let me see how that works. And I'm going to start with some preliminaries about multilingualism and multiliteracy. So nowadays, we're talking about multilingualism as if this is something very new. But I wanted to stress out that this is not something new. There has been multilingualism through the centuries. So it's not new. There have been multilinguals during the Roman Empire, during the 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia. In several countries, people were speaking different languages. So for example, in England, the common people used to speak English, the aristocracy used to speak French, and the clergy used to speak Latin. In the Ottoman Empire, different communities used to speak different languages. And people would communicate, and those societies were flourishing. So multilingualism is not something new. Also, people used to read and write. So multiliteracy is also not something new. So the picture you can see here on these slides is a glossary from it's Sumerian Akkadian glossary, and it's on the Louvre. So at the time, 3000 BC, people used to write in different systems, and they had the glossaries. Now, at the time, not everyone was able to read and write. So a soldier in the Roman Empire didn't necessarily read, but someone who was an administrator had to be able to read and write. So multiliteracy also is not something new, but multiliteracy depends on education, and multilingualism, to a large extent, depends on the education, and this is why I mentioned that within the education panel. So the education system has to provide opportunities for the children to be able to learn the languages and to be able to learn how to read and write. Because if we don't have an education system that provides those opportunities, then we will not have multilinguals who can read and write in multiple languages. Now, of course, now we are on the 21st century. Things have changed, and there has been an increase in multilingual citizens for many different reasons. So the issue of globalization has been raised in several presentations, but there is also the issue of urbanization. So in every country, there are people from the provinces moving to the big cities, and that is also bringing languages into the big cities. We also have EU policies that have led to multilingualism. So, for example, there is the policy that at school we have to provide 2 foreign languages. It's not a legal requirement, but education systems are encouraged to provide 2 foreign languages. And in some systems it works really well, and that's why we have multilinguals. For example, I'm now at the University of Konstanz, and from my students, we don't have anyone who is monolingual. Everyone is at least bilingual, and we have several people who are trilingual, and these are usually the people who come from an ethnic minority, second-generation migrants in Germany, who may speak Turkish in the home, German from the society, French because they learn it at school, and maybe there is another language. So EU policies also have a positive effect in terms of creating multilingual citizens. Another important aspect is the recognition that language rights are an integral part of human rights. And so it's important that people have language rights and they develop the languages that are part of their community. Now, in the past, as I mentioned, literacy was not for everyone. It was for the elite. But nowadays, literacy is very important. In order to be able to navigate a city, many cities have different signs. Here you see, So this is a sign in Singapore. Singapore is a multilingual country, so they have signs in many different languages. This is a street sign from London, Brick Lane. There is as you know, London is also a multilingual city. If you live in a city and you are multilingual, you may have to be able to read in the language where your rent contract is written in. So I live now in Germany. I had to read my contract in German. I had to read my employment contract. Then we have our apps. Every app has terms and conditions. When I download the app, it asks me, shall I have access to your contacts? I have to be able to read it in order to decide a yes or a no. Then, of course, reading is a window to culture. And also reading is a tool for learning and for developing skills. So to be able to have language and to be able to read is a way to learn more. So this is hugely important also for future employment. So literacy skills are very important nowadays. So what I'm going to do in this talk, I'm going to present to you two studies. One study is from the UK, and I'm going to look at multilingualism resulting from migration to the UK. And the second study is from India. And India is a very important country and very interesting country because multilingualism is not the outcome of migration. It can also be the outcome of migration if you have people from one state migrating to another state, or from a rural part of India coming to an urban part of India. That's also another possibility, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So I'm going to bring two different dimensions on the table to have a discussion. And then I'm going to do some general implications and the take-home message. And the take-home message I'm going to give you also now. So you can have a look at it, and then you can think throughout the talk, how is this take-home message? What kind of evidence am I going to bring? So the first take-home message is that supporting the languages of migrant communities can bring benefits to the language of the society. So if we support a heritage language, that can benefit the majority language. So in the context of the UK, if we support Greek, that may have a benefit for English. And I'm going to show you a study that shows exactly that. And for the second study, that English medium instruction schools are not a ticket for success. Mother tongue education can bring advantages in terms of educational outcomes. And I'm going to compare schools that have English medium to schools that have Hindi medium. Okay, but let's start with the first study, which is in the UK, and this is part of the PhD of one of my students in Reading, Theodora Papastefanou, who did this study, and she's now finishing. Now, what is the background of the study? So this links a little bit to what Professor Sorace mentioned earlier. There is a perception in the UK and in other countries that if we support the languages of the migrant communities, that may have a negative effect on the majority. So if we support the heritage languages, the children may not be able to learn the language of the country. So some schools and some teachers are recommending to the families, use English in the home. So we want to find out, is there any evidence that actually there is a link? There is relatively limited research in the UK on how children develop the two languages side by side, and if the perception of this is true or not. So the aim of that study was to compare how bilingual primary school children performed in the heritage language, and that was Greek, versus the majority language, and that was English, in terms of language and reading tasks. And we wanted to do reading because of the importance of literacy. We also wanted to compare the performance of those children to English monolingual children. And we also wanted to address if there is a relationship between language and reading skills and language use within the home and outside the home. And that links to the presentation that Ellen did earlier. Now, who were the participants? We had 40 Greek-English bilingual children. They were in the first year of primary school and in the third year of primary school. And then we had 40 monolingual English-speaking children of the same age who were going more or less to the same schools. All the monolingual English children, actually all the children were going to mainstream English schools, but the children from the Greek community were also attending a Saturday school for a couple of hours every week where they learned how to read and write in Greek, and they also had some cultural activities. And the parents filled in a survey about the language use in the home and outside of the home so that we can have an idea what is the language environment where they grow up. Now, we had several measures, and I'm going to present to you 2 measures of language. The one is blending, the other one is called elision. So these are metalinguistic awareness tasks of phonological awareness. So we're looking at whether children are able to use the metalinguistic awareness with language. So for the blending, we were giving them sounds, like the sound a, r, I, f, m, o, s. They had to put that together into a word, arithmos, which in Greek it means number. And then we were giving them a word like lemoni, and they had to delete the first syllable. So they had to say moni. So they had to do that in Greek, they had to do that in English, and the tasks were very similar. And then they also had to read real words, and they also had to read novel words, and we were looking at how good they were in reading. So for the first task, they wouldn't see anything. Everything was, they would listen to the sounds. For the second one, they would see the word, they had to read them. And I'm going to show you straight away the results. So in these complex figures, you always see Greek on the left, English on the right, and then gray is for year 1, and blue is for year 3. So you will see that, and I have put in a red square the English, you will see that the English, the bars are higher than Greek. So for all the tasks, all the 4 tasks, they were better in English compared to Greek. So English is the majority language, Greek is the heritage language. And for all of them, the children in year 3 are better than in year 1. That's not surprising. But for all the tasks, we saw that they were better in the majority language than in the minority language. Now let's have a look how they compare to the monolingual children. So here you're going to see the bilingual children are on the left and the monolingual children on the right. So we can see that the bilingual children are better than the monolingual children in all of the tasks. Now, when we saw that, we were very surprised because a lot of the literature shows the opposite. And we've heard also in the previous talks that this is quite often the opposite. But here we are measuring the metalinguistic awareness, so how they can manipulate sounds. And if people speak several languages, that may make it easier for them to be able to manipulate sounds that are more sensitive in what is a syllable and what is a sound. How do we put the sounds together? Then we also wanted to look at the relationship between language and reading skills and language use within the home and outside of the home. And surprisingly for English, we didn't find any relationship. So it didn't matter if they had a lot of English in the home, if they had a lot of English outside of the home, it didn't make any difference. But for Greek, it mattered. The children who had a lot of language activities outside of the home, which means basically if they went with other children to do different other activities, they had better skills in Greek than the ones who didn't do many activities on Greek outside of the home. So to conclude the first study, we found that children have better language and reading skills in English compared to Greek. And so schooling in English seems to be enough for children to develop English skills. And English schooling seems to be leveling out the effect of what happens in the home. So supporting the Greek language does not negatively affect how they learn English, and parental support should be directed towards the heritage language rather than the majority language. Because they will learn English anyway, they get a lot of input in the school. So this is the conclusion of study number 1. Now, we're going to come to the second study, which is in India. Now, what is the background of that study? So we know several studies in the past have shown that the large proportion of children who attend state schools in India leave school with low educational achievement, and that particularly affects literacy and numeracy, mathematical skills. So a lot of children also drop out of school, and they have very low literacy skills. At the same time, there is an expansion of schools who have English as a medium of instruction. And that is not just the private schools. This is also the state schools. Now, in the private schools in India, India has excellent private schools. So if you look at what happens in the private schools, there is no problem. The problem is with the state schools. So we wanted to look at the effects in the state schools, and to have a look at what supports good learning outcomes from state schools. So we did a study where we wanted to measure what factors lead to high versus low learning outcomes at school. And we had learning outcomes as the measure, and we looked at literacy, numeracy, and also we looked at cognitive skills. And then we had many different factors. So we had some educational variables. For example, if the school ran with English as a medium of instruction compared to mother tongue as a medium of instruction. When we looked at linguistic diversity in the school, so how many different languages are spoken by the children in the classroom? Does that matter? We looked at teacher qualification and school pedagogies. So what was the qualification of the teachers? Did they have training in terms of multilingual classrooms? What kind of pedagogies were being used? Were the books, in what language were the books in? Were they in Hindi? Were they in English? Did they have books with multiple languages? And then we looked at effects of gender, because we know that there are gender inequalities in India. We looked at effects of socioeconomic status. Does it make a difference if a child lives in a slum versus lives in an accommodation in an apartment? And also the geographical disparity, if they live in an urban setting, whether if they live in a rural setting. Now, I only have another possibly 5 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to talk about all of this. That's why I singled out mother tongue education, because I think that is also relevant for many of us here in this room. This is a larger project, and there was a team in the UK. The PI of the project is Professor Yanthi Simpli, and we also had colleagues in India who coordinated the data collection in India. The data collection took place in 3 different states, in Delhi, in Hyderabad, and also in Bihar. But today I'm only going to present you data from Delhi. Now, what do we know about languages spoken in the classroom in India? Today, in the morning, we heard several presentations about the monolingual classrooms. Now, in India, India has a legislation according to which there is a 3-language formula in terms of medium of instruction. So schools should have a regional language or a mother tongue, an additional modern Indian language, which is quite often Hindi, and also English as a lingua franca in the country. And then every school operationalizes it in a slightly different way. So Hindi and English function as linked languages across the population in India, and the central government recognizes Hindi as the official language and English as the provisional sub-language. The participants in this study were very large compared to the first study I presented. So we had 1,200 children across the 3 different states, so roughly about 400 children in every state, and the age range was between 8 and 12 years. And from the children in Delhi, we had 251 children going to an English medium instruction school, and the other 146 in a Hindi medium school. Now, the state language in Delhi is Hindi, and this is why we have a lot of Hindi as a medium instruction schools. So let's go straight to the results. So I'm going to present you results from literacy and from mathematical skills. So in terms of measuring literacy, we asked children to recognize letters. We asked them to read words, read sentences, and read short passages. And we were measuring how accurate they are in terms of reading the word, identifying the letters, reading the words, sentences, and passages. And here what we see is blue is for Hindi and green is for English. And on the left are the schools that have Hindi as a medium of instruction. On the right, we have the schools that have English as the medium of instruction. Now, we can see that in terms of Hindi, which is the language of the majority, there is no difference. In terms of English, the children who go to an English medium school have better literacy in English. That's, again, not surprising. They get more English. They have better skills in terms of English. But what happens with maths? Now, from an educational perspective, to be able to learn maths, you learn maths through language. You have to be able to communicate in the language to understand the mathematical concepts and the terms. So here we see that the children who go to a Hindi school are better than the children who go to an English medium school in subtraction. So we looked at subtraction and division. So in both subtraction and division, the Hindi medium children are better than the English medium children. And we also looked at mathematical reasoning. One of them was word problems. So you probably all remember from your school years when there were some mathematical problems with children who have to open a tap and leave some water into buckets, or animals, and we have to measure how many legs and how many heads. So these are the kind of mathematical word problems where that links to reality, basically. So using mathematical skills to subtract and add, but it's in a real context. And again, the children for the Hindi medium schools are better from the English medium school. And the same thing for metamaths. So metamaths is we were giving them some exercises that were done in a wrong way. And then we said, well, why do you think this child made the wrong calculation? So they had to say, because they didn't add the second number to the first number, or subtraction. So they had to tell us why the problem was wrong. So in both of them, again, Hindi schools, children in Hindi schools perform better than English schools. So the conclusion from the second study is that in terms of literacy, children who go to an English medium school have better English literacy than children who go to the Hindi medium school, but for Hindi there is no difference. For maths, the children who go to a Hindi medium school have better mathematical skills than the ones who go to an English medium school. So the implication is that English as a medium of instruction is not the ticket for success. It can lead to lower educational outcomes for the children. Now, of course, the other important aspect to think about is it better in India to speak English or to know how to do maths? So that's another issue which we're not going to be able to address or to discuss, but it's for everyone to think. I'm going to go back to the take-home messages from the two studies. So supporting the language of the migrant communities, the heritage language, can bring benefits to the language of the society, because we saw that the children who were learning how to read and write in Greek had better literacy skills than the monolingual English children, and also the English was better than the Greek. So having Greek, supporting Greek is an opportunity. But at the same time, it's a challenge, because how do you support the heritage language within the school system? So we heard that it's actually very difficult. And in the UK, there is no support, at least in England, there is no support for the heritage languages within the school system. So those children had to go to a Saturday school for a couple of hours a week in order to get support for the heritage language. The second take-home message is that English medium schools are not a ticket to success, so it's challenging, so that creates a challenge. If we send our children, at least for the Indian context, to an English medium school, it doesn't necessarily mean this is a ticket for success. But of course, there is a difference between the private schools and the state schools. So this is not, we can't generalize it to everything. If there is an excellent, very well supported and very, very well resourced school with very well trained teachers, then English medium can be very good. But if the school doesn't have a lot of resources, if the teachers don't have very good training, then it may not bring positive outcome. On the other hand, mother tongue education can bring advantages in terms of educational outcomes, and this is an opportunity. So if we don't have the resources, then maybe it's better to have mother tongue education rather than jump and do English as a medium of instruction. So this is to acknowledge the team, because this is not a study that I did it on my own. So there was a very large team of people in the UK and in India. We also had a lot of support from the British Council India and the Language and Learning Foundation. And we also had many consultants who advised us about how to do research in India. And thank you to you for your attention.
Thank you very much. After two presentations, we will have time for discussions and for questions too. But now, thank you, Professor Marinis. And now I am very glad to present a young researcher from Estonia. Actually, Kerttu Rozenvalde, she's not only a multilingual person, she's a multi-graduate person. She graduated from University of Tartu, University of Helsinki, and her PhD she got from University of Latvia. So it's 3 universities, at least. And she defended her PhD dissertation that investigated the interplay of languages in higher education, comparatively in Estonia and Latvia. And now Kerttu is going to present some results and developing of her PhD dissertation, multilingual language use and ideology of one language at a time, insights into language issues in higher education. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be part of this conference, inspiring talks all day long. My paper will somehow be quite closely linked to what has already been said today. I will speak about higher education and language issues in higher education. As Birute already said earlier, this is a hot topic here in Estonia, in political circles, in academic circles, as well as it raises questions among the general public. And in this paper, I wish to elaborate on the results of my PhD research, in which, as Birute already said, I asked what role different languages play in higher education in Estonia and Latvia, particularly at the national universities, the University of Tartu and the University of Latvia. As this is the Estonian integration conference, so I will speak about Estonia here. In my PhD research, I studied the role of languages in language management, in ideologies and attitudes, as well as a little bit in actual language use. And one of the conclusions I reached was that students tend to make use of a wide variety of linguistic resources they possess while studying at university, sometimes using these languages simultaneously, However, at the ideological level, both the students I interviewed for my research, as well as language policymakers who write legislative texts and policy planning documents, tend to emphasize that while it is important to use multiple languages in Estonian higher education, mixing these languages is not something they would particularly value. In other words, several languages are used in the university setting. At least sometimes it happens that several languages are used to achieve one interactional or communicative aim. This has also been shown by other pieces of research, such as Söderlund in Sweden and Losland in Norway. However, students and language policymakers tend to depict languages as separate, segmented, bordered entities, something that should ideally not be mixed. And in this paper, I wish to elaborate on these findings, to draw more attention to the difference between language ideologies and attitudes, language ideologies and practices in higher education. That is, the ideology of drawing borders between languages and actual language practices in which such borders might not exist. I also tried to elaborate on the question whether the success of the top-down language policies depends on taking actual linguistic practices into account and what could possibly be the benefit of it. The data here comes from documents authored by the Estonian state, the University of Tartu, and the interviews I did with the students of the University of Tartu in 2016. To begin with, there is a growing body of literature on translanguaging, something that has been mentioned for several times today. In my understandings, translanguaging stems from the understanding that dividing languages into named entities is a political and cultural phenomenon. In other words, labeling languages is arbitrary, and named languages such as Estonian, English, and Russian are cultural, political phenomena rather than natural and biological entities. Instead, Leeway, one of the main proponents of translanguaging, argues that human beings might have an innate translanguaging instinct, a capacity to draw on as many linguistic, cognitive, semiotic resources as available to them in order to interpret meaning intentions and to design their actions accordingly. According to his theory that is based on psycholinguistic research on bilingualism, human mind is a holistic multi-competence that firstly does not divide languages into differently labeled languages, language varieties, styles, and registers. And secondly, the human mind does not divide languages from other cognitive and semiotic competencies, such as memory, attention, emotion. Well, this is a theory as long as we don't know what is going on in the brain exactly. But anyway, he does not deny the existence of labeled languages, but he argues that these are politically, culturally, historically, ideologically grounded entities, not what is actually taking place in human interactions. And instead, he argues that humans use all linguistic resources in order to interact. Thus, we move freely between languages, language varieties, styles, and registers. And as a result, he calls monolingualism at an individual level a myth. By contrast, monolingualism can be a reality in policies and ideologies, as it often is that nation states might have monolingual policies despite the fact that different languages coexist in society. The favoring of monolingualism is what Leeway calls the ideology of one language only, and the support to keeping languages apart, pure, is what he calls the ideology of one language at the time. But again, he stresses that these ideologies serve political purposes and do not apply to everyday social interactions during which multilinguals freely move between languages. Furthermore, the ideologies of one language at a time can be observed also in the case of university language policy here. Although the state of Estonia and the University of Tartu support the use of multiple languages in higher education, and in my PhD thesis I have argued that mostly still just Estonian and English are the languages that are institutionally supported. In top-down language policy, languages tend to be depicted as bordered and separate entities, and multilingual practices are not mentioned. The students, however, describe their bilingual and multilingual language use in the interviews. I will give you some examples. The examples on the slide show how students make use of their linguistic repertoires in their studies. Even when the courses nominally take place in one or another language, the examples I have chosen show that these students make use of multiple languages they possess in order to understand what they are studying. As I already said at the beginning of my talk, these examples have been gained through interviews with students. Another, possibly better way to collect data on language use at grassroots level would be ethnographic research that I have not done. So the first example illustrates language use of a bachelor student of physics who says that she speaks Estonian as mother tongue. She claims to speak English very well, German well, and have some knowledge of Russian. And during her interview, she says, "Of course, everything is in English in the English medium courses. At times, helpful extra materials are being handed out in Estonian in order for us to understand what we should search for, so that we wouldn't drown in the language. In the Estonian medium courses, materials are mainly in Estonian, but if you want to read some extra materials, these are in English. Whenever we are given something to read in Estonian, we are also informed about the materials available in Russian. I've noticed that Russian medium textbooks are suggested as main textbooks, mainly for Russian-speaking students, but the materials in English are more like extra reading materials. I've sometimes tried to read extra materials in German and Russian. Maybe there's something better than in English and Estonian, just to find better sources." So this is a fine example that shows that although the classes of this student are nominally held either in Estonian or English, the student makes use of her wide linguistic repertoire, in this case to read extra materials in order to understand what is being taught. Another example I have chosen illustrates the same thing from a slightly different viewpoint. In this example, a bachelor student of chemistry who speaks Estonian as mother tongue and claims to speak English and German very well. She has lived in Germany as a child and went to school there. When asked what language has been the most useful for her during her studies, she says, "Let's say that English has been the most useful, but at the same time, something comes from German, and then it is good to have that extra knowledge, extra language, because you have some weird terminology that you are able to remember more easily because you have that German knowledge." And it is worth to point out that this student claimed not to have used German in any other way during her studies. She said that she hasn't done any readings in German, she hasn't communicated to anyone in German, but she still points out that her knowledge of German is useful for her in order to understand what she is studying in other languages. So this is what I understand by students using their entire linguistic repertoires. In a way, it could be said that there is no switch off to the knowledge of language we have. As said earlier today, we cannot take some part of our linguistic knowledge outside of our heads and put it in a chest of drawers and then continue with some other part. By contrast, here are some excerpts from top-down policy documents that exemplify the legitimating of the ideology of one language at the time, the ideology of drawing borders between languages. The first example is an excerpt from the Universities Act, a state-level document, but the same idea has been repeated in the documents of the University of Tartu. The Act stipulates that language of instruction at universities is either Estonian or a language other than Estonian. In other words, one or another, but not both at the same time, or not several languages at a time. So this is a good example how ideologically languages are being kept apart. The next example is from the development plan of the Estonian language that describes the current situation in Estonian academia as such that students who enter Estonian medium bachelor studies can complete their studies mainly in Estonian, and at times some subjects or subject groups might be taught in a foreign language. Again, for teaching and learning activities within a single course, the medium of instruction is depicted to be either one or another, but not both or several languages at the time. I have two more examples. These come from the interviews again and show that the students who practice translanguaging themselves still tend to overtly support the ideology of monolingualism. Although these students tend to use multiple languages in their studies, they still stress in other parts of the interviews that they would rather prefer studying in one or another language and not to use several languages at the time. So the first example comes from the same bachelor student of physics who I quoted before. In the first part of the example, she says that she describes how she uses several languages in a communicative situation. And the other part of the example that will continue on the next slide will show her overt attitude to mixing languages. While in the first part, she describes using multiple languages, and she says that it feels natural to her. In the latter part, she claims that mixing languages is difficult, so she would rather not do it. So at the beginning here, she describes how she talks to a lecturer that is Estonian, but lectures in English. And she says, when I go up to the lecturer with the question, I ask it in Estonian. It happens in a way that I use English terminology that I know, but my sentences are in Estonian, so this is like a mixed language of Estonian and English. By accident, I've started speaking in English, but then it just feels weird to speak that way. So she describes how mixing languages in this communicative situation feels natural for her. However, in another part of the interview, she says that it is difficult to move between Estonian and English, and I get puzzled, so it's easier to speak one language only. And when asked in which language she preferred to continue her studies, would it be just one language or several languages, she says that she'd like to continue studying in English, and if she'd dare, she'd study in Russian. The final example is from the interview with the chemistry student that I also quoted before. During the interview, she also described using both Estonian and English for reading, for coursing, for communicating with her peers. But when answering the same question about the languages she would potentially like to study in, she says, I'd find it easier if all my studies had been in English from scratch. If you'll continue doing what you're doing, it's good to practice doing it in English from scratch. But at the same time, the beginning is the most difficult part. So I find that at the beginning, the studies could take place in mother tongue. Then you understand and nothing gets lost in translation. So I don't know which way is better. So both of these examples illustrate that while students tend to use their wide linguistic repertoires during their studies, they still believe in keeping languages separate. The examples outlined above show that language practices and ideologies tend to differ. So one of the questions I posed at the beginning of this talk was why? Why do language practices and ideologies differ in the academic context? One of the possible answers could thus be that while we use language the way that feels natural to us, the way it is used, attitudes towards language use in higher education tend to be dominated by the ideology of one language at a time. It could be that mixing languages is not considered to be a sign of creativity and criticality that it could be, but rather a sign of unintelligence and laziness. So it has been shown also by other pieces of research that people, for instance, who code switch themselves, consider it to be something they shouldn't do. Furthermore, I asked whether the success of top-down language policies depend on taking actual language practices into account. And one of the outstanding language policy researchers, Bernard Polski, stresses that language management, that is, efforts by certain actors to manipulate language situation, ideologies and practices are not necessarily congruent. However, he says that language practices are the real language policy. It is what actually happens. And the potential of language management to be as real depends on its congruity with actual language use and ideologies. So in the case of language matters in Estonian higher education, I would thus argue that language management might be rather congruent with popular ideologies, but could possibly differ from the actual language use. Some new questions arise. Whether and how to bring language management efforts closer to language practices on the ground. What could possibly happen if language policymakers started recommending more translanguaging practices? Would legitimating translanguaging practices be useful for Estonian or the other way around? Would it have a detrimental effect on the language, taking into account that the number of speakers of Estonian is relatively low in comparison to the number of speakers and the position of languages that we mainly have contact with, that is English and Russian? Would it perhaps be possible that by legitimating translanguaging practices in higher education, we would no longer think that Estonian is losing ground to English in academia, but perceive the situation more as it could be, that is higher education as a sphere of life where multiple languages, including Estonian, are used and should be used? So all of these questions are up to discussion. I'll add some comments. How to bring language policy closer to language practices? Recognizing and legitimating translanguaging practices would be one opportunity. Would it have a beneficial or detrimental effect on Estonian? Well, translanguaging is an effective mechanism for prestige planning, says Kevin Carroll. In other words, institutional support to languages makes them more prestigious among their speakers. At the moment, I would argue that there are two languages that enjoy wide institutional support in Estonian higher education. These are Estonian and English. And giving institutional support to translanguaging practices, that is, stressing the importance of using wider linguistic repertoires in higher education that students and academic staff possess, could broaden the horizons of language use and thus help fight the global hegemonic role of English as academic language, a very prestigious language in Estonian academia. Another substantial benefit we would gain from legitimating translanguaging practices could be a deeper understanding of how we use language, why we use language in that manner, and so on. Awareness, language awareness, has been mentioned also earlier today. And by we, I mean both language users and language policymakers. So in other words, spontaneous translanguaging seems to take place anyway among multilinguals, but intentional and controlled translanguaging could be a powerful language policy mechanism. Zenos and Carter write about translanguaging as a sustainable language policy mechanism for regional minority languages, that is, languages that are in close contact with greater majority languages that enjoy more institutional support. They argue that translanguaging could be sustainable for such languages, not only when it happens spontaneously, but when it is controlled and intentional. Of course, Estonian is not a regional minority language. It is a state language used fully in all spheres of life. However, it is still small enough for its users to be in close contact with greater languages as well. So this argument could apply to Estonian as well. Legitimating or understanding translanguaging practices could bring ideology closer to actual practices. We could possibly estimate the threats to the existence of Estonian as the language of higher education and science more accurately. Becoming more aware of our actual linguistic practices could help us understand that, for example, although PhD theses are often written in English and Estonian, that is, the end product is in English, the process good, and I'd think that it often does for multilingual doctoral students, include the use of other languages as well. Think, for example, about the process of writing the thesis. It involves collecting data, discussing results with peers, and so on. Becoming aware of how we use language could help us understand that it is not one or another, but often several languages at a time for one purpose. And using several languages is important for multilinguals for achieving their interactional and social aims, such as getting a PhD. So in conclusion, this talk has just outlined a gap between ideologies and grassroots practices. I would like to suggest and stress that more research into actual language use in academia should be carried out in order to understand the complexity of the matter more clearly. If successful language policy takes into account actual language use and ideologies, these should be studied more carefully before developing policies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kerttu. And now Theo and Kerttu, please enjoy this company and we can discuss our issues together and with the audience too. Kerttu, tule ka siia. Let's start with multilingual families in education. In Estonia, as I said, it's a very hot topic now, languages in education. And during this year, it has been prepared curriculum for kindergarten education, preschool education. Actually, it has been prepared twice, and now it's the third one in preparing stage. And there is a lot of discussion, and one of the issue raised during this discussion is one phrase from the document, and the phrase is multilingual families, they are problems for the educational system. Would you comment this?
Yeah, I mean, we hear that in many countries, multilingualism being viewed as a problem. And again, it's because of the monolingual lens. And because if we provide multilingual education is not easy. it requires a lot of resources, and it is expensive. So if the schools and if the educational system is monolingual, then it means there's going to be books only in one language. The teachers will have training in one language. Everything is going to be in one language. So some of the rhetoric from politicians is also because of financial reasons, and some are because of ideological reasons. So I'm not sure why it is a problem, have multilingual education been viewed as a problem. But if we come back to the issue of the language being a human right, then we have to offer education in the languages. We have to support the languages one way or another. So, yes, it is viewed as a problem, but I think there is a debate to be made. What are the advantages? And in my talk, I showed some advantages. If we support the other language, if we support the heritage language, then there can be some advantages in terms also of the majority language. Now, after my talk, we had a little chat with Ellen, and she said, well, does it matter if the heritage language has a different alphabet? Because in Greek has a different alphabet from English, and also Greek has a transparent orthography. So if you learn how to read and write in a transparent orthography, maybe it's easier than to read and write in an opaque orthography like English. And so this could be a reason why it brought an advantage. Now, within the Estonian context, you know, what are the languages? It's Estonian, it's Russian, and then there could be other languages through migration.
Actually, we have 200 native languages in Estonia spoken.
Right.
How we can manage in all these languages the education. But thank you for your comment. But Kerttu, maybe you want to add something? You had your own experience as a multilingual person, or not?
The monolingual lens that has been spoken today has got some coverage here. It's very difficult to give up, particularly, I think, among the general public. So I liked the paper by Sanita Lazdina before, in which she said that in Latvia, even if this multilingual lens is making its way to national policy, then it's the general public that is the most difficult to convince about the necessity to do things slightly differently than we have done so far.
Okay. But actually, this multilingual families, I understand your talk about the educational system, but the meaning in concerning these documents is that if the multilingual family sends the children into the Estonian school, it would be a problem. But the same situation in other countries. Families with a migrant background, with another home language, they are sending the children into the school with other language. And you show that there is no problems to get educated in state language, in official language, or not?
Yeah, so our data show that if you support the heritage language, if you support the other language other than the majority, this is not going to affect negatively the majority language. Of course, we have to bring that in the context of the study taking place in the UK. And in the UK, English is a very, English we discussed today is a very strong language. You know, and in other countries, we have the fear that other languages may disappear. Of course, in the UK, English is the language, is the most important language, is so powerful that maybe this is the reason why if we support the heritage language, that doesn't affect negatively. That doesn't necessarily mean that we can transfer this to any other country. Because if we transfer this to a country where the majority language is not as strong and as prestigious and as powerful, that may have a negative effect. So I think that's important. What is the context?
The context is very important, and the attitudes concerning the language acquisition and the language prestige, and not only the state ideology, but on the grassroots level, that how prestigious is the language and how important is the acquisition of the language for the person or for the families and so on.
Yeah. And in the UK, because children learn English anyway, what we are recommending is that they have to support the heritage language, because otherwise they're not going to learn it. And anecdotally actually, I didn't present these data, but in the questionnaire we also asked the parents, do the children, are they better in English or in Greek? And for the majority, they said English. So the parents are aware. Anecdotally, in some of those families, the parents said that the children come back from school, they don't want to speak Greek because there is so much power in English, so the children are refusing to speak Greek. But when they go to the Greek school, because they had to go to the Greek school, then there is a benefit to English. So I think that's also the specific context.
Yes. Maybe audience would like to ask questions. Yes, we start here.
I'm really... Yep, I'll go with the questions. I have really long question. I will try to be as short as possible. When I see the human evolution, one of the way of survival that we are doing exchange through currency. So if you want to do exchange, you started with the currency evolution. And then, for example, the recent updates I am saying is a European currency. You can see the euro is one of the common currency, and maybe it have certain advantages. I just want to understand this human evolution, maybe after 200 years, 300 years, the way maybe uniting currency is helping somehow, I don't know how much, what can be the way uniting maybe somehow language, what we can do now. So if it is possible, so after 100 years, 200 years, something can be as beneficial as uniting euro currency, something like this?
Well, I think it's easier to share currency than because then you decide, okay, this is this one currency, let's create the euro, and then everyone that is part of the Eurozone can use the euro. I think that is, not possible to do it, unless we say, let's everyone speak English. But I don't think that this is something that people want, because the currency doesn't have the cultural identity that the language has. People may say also the currency has some cultural identity, and there are people in some Eurozone countries who miss the Deutsche Mark or the other local currencies, but it's different. It's not like a language that has an identity. Someone mentioned the Esperanto. Esperanto was a very good experiment, and Esperanto is still being used, but I'm not sure that it's been used as much as when it was created. When it was created, there was a buzz about Esperanto, and I'm not sure where we are now with Esperanto.
Well, there are two countries that are not members of the European Union that still use euro, so haven't they accepted some cultural values through accepting euro? So, But of course,
there are identity matters, but there are richness of the culture. That we have so many languages we can communicate, and I don't want to be without other languages and to use only one language, and I think all the audience are meaning the same.
I think on the issue of richness, the other important aspect is when there are many different languages in a country, but actually in education we only have one or two, that means that the children who speak in the homes those other languages, and in some countries these are indigenous languages, if the indigenous languages are not within the educational system, then they're under threat, and then they may be dying out. This is what happens in India. a lot of languages, indigenous languages, are dying out because they are not part of the educational system. So children go to school, they don't learn. Some of them may not even be written languages. And so education has a very positive aspect, as we discussed in the morning, because if you have education, you get developed skills. But actually, in terms of indigenous languages or minority languages, it may have the opposite effect if these languages are not supported.
Okay, thank you. There was a question there.
Hello, thank you for so nice presentations. My name is Trine. And I had this comment about multilingual concerning context, because I lived for 10 years in Western and Central and Northern Europe, in Italy, in France, in Switzerland, in Norway, in Denmark for a while. So, and I always had to explain, even to the best traveled and best educated persons, that Estonia has its own identity and culture, because it was often associated with Russia. Of course, so what I want to comment and maybe ask your opinion, that in some contexts maybe, of course I agree that I want to teach to my children different languages, but the Russian maybe is not the first foreign language I'd like to teach, because you know, then I go to Europe, and in Europe we know, actually I wanted to comment the first speaker who said that we spoke about this English, but he said that we should also give opportunity to different languages like French, Russian, German. Actually, on European context, it's not true, because we know the children in elementary or in secondary school, no one really studies Russia in Europe, in Western or Northern or Central Europe. So my comment is that on Estonian context, being as Estonian, which has been, you know, the history occupied, and Russia is a huge, it's a huge nation and a huge identity. So as a tiny, after Iceland, I think it's the second tiniest European nation. So this multicultural, like when Estonian children now go to those kindergarten schools together with Russian children, and those Russian children still convey this identity that most of their families look from the Putin propaganda. They celebrate the darkest days of our history when we were occupied. They celebrate this as a liberation. And I really don't see why we really don't, we speak only about this multiculturalism, but we need to see the context. In Estonian case, it has many disadvantages, I see, and the threats which I see that we talk a little, only a little. So yeah, your comment on this Estonian context, considering the multiculturalism, as you know, in Tallinn, for example, we have only 52% Estonians, which is the tiniest speaking mother language Estonian in all the European capitals. We have more than 30% of Russian mother language speakers, which is the biggest with Latvia in all Europe. So in this context, speaking about multiculturalism and multilanguages, we really need to see the context. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you for comments. Actually, I think nobody talking about no knowing of state language and not to preserving of Estonian language as an official language and the state language. I'm sure that Estonian school system is going to emerge the two type of the schools into the one type of the school. But actually, knowledge and other languages, knowledge of other cultures is always useful. And when we are looking what languages our children are studying at school, we can see that the first place is English as a foreign language, and the second place is coming Russian or and not German, but Russian language. And I'm pretty sure that at university level, it's a very sad thing that our young historians, our young Venno-Ugrists don't know Russian language because they cannot work in their professional life very well without knowledge of language. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the Soome-ugri is a very good example because we see what has happened with Soome-ugri in Russia. They have basically died out, our Soome-ugri tribes in Russia, what you mentioned. And that was my real comment that I really wanted to say that, of course, I'm not talking about studying Russia as a language. Of course, it is a language of Dostoevsky and Pushkin, everything. But I spoke more about this integration part, that if you create those common schools where maybe 30 or 50%, which is the reality in Tallinn, you have only 52% of Estonians. So the reality is that half of those students would be Russian mother tongue. That was, and with Russian mother tongue, they convey this identity, who listens to Putin's propaganda, most, not all, of course there are many people who don't, but mostly, and who celebrate those saddest days for our history as the days of victory, etc. You know, the background. So what my point was that in some contexts, the language, the identity, and let's say the cultural background that one culture conveys cannot be only enriching.
You want to comment? No?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also a political issue. And so it's inevitable that politics always play a role when it comes to languages. And when we see what happened in the past, I'm not very familiar with the Estonian context, but if we look at the UK context, where Welsh, for example, was not supported in the schools and people were not allowed to speak Welsh, then Welsh almost disappeared. And then there is now a revival because Welsh came back to the schools. And so we see examples all across the world that a language policy may affect positively or may affect negatively. And then we have countries like in Canada with the Francophone and the Anglophone, or in Switzerland where it's the Francophone and the German and the Italian, where they decided what languages will be spoken in the school, and that then the other communities have to learn the other language as a subject. And so there are ways around, but there's always also a political issue there, and then the country has to decide what the country wants for the future. And this is a political, I think, discussion that needs to be done within Estonia, rather than because this is happening in the UK, let's do the same thing, or because this is happening in Canada, let's do the same thing. There has to be some debate, I think, within Estonia to come to a conclusion for this.
In the university setting, I was surprised when I talked to the students that they quite often saw Russian just as a foreign language that they need in the labor market in Estonia. So it's a foreign language they wish to study. They wish to have a better command of. They were sorry that they were not so fluent in Russian. No ideological connotations there. So
I am agree on university level. At university level, the classes for Russian, they are full because the students want to study Russian language. There is no political reason. The language as a language. And as I told, for some specialities, it's a very big need to know Russian, but not only Russian. It's very pity that we don't have a good knowledge of German language now. In humanities. When I studied at Tartu University, it was the last century, and then was so that all Estonian philologies in our curricula, it was German lessons, German courses. And even for those students, they are coming from the schools without German knowledge, they started to study German. Now for philologists, for historians, no German, not at all. And then it's very sad. But now we have last minute, maybe one short question.
I'll make it brief. So I'm speaking as a researcher here. I'm coming back to this money and language metaphor because language is a very different thing. It is the language of my mother's lullabies. It's like grandmother's pancakes, and maybe someone's first love is in another language. And so all those emotions are related to languages. And then we have those practical that Birute said. Practical languages, we just learn them because we need them. But I wanted sort of to throw a challenge to this board that we now, in education, we have children that are not bilingual, but who are trilingual, who have lived in many countries, and who come to schools with this rich, very rich background and baggage of languages. And for a small country like Estonia, this is an advantage. This is something we should profit from, but it is a huge challenge, both for our competence that we have at school, for our teachers who are not so trilingual themselves, maybe, and for our finances. So please, if you could comment on how to deal with the situation of 3 or 4 lingual children, that is the modern reality. Thank you.
In terms of having trilingual or children who speak 4 languages, that doesn't mean that the school has to provide teachers who speak all those different languages. But it's important that the teachers are sensitive and the teachers know that I have this one child in the classroom who also speaks Turkish, and there is this other child who also speaks Arabic, because every language is a resource. And the teacher can make use of those resources in the classroom by saying, so how is this object or how is this term in that language, and how is that in the other language? Because this is from a self-esteem perspective and from an emotional perspective, it also gives value to the language and gives value to the child. And so if the teachers receive some training about how to deal with multilingual classrooms, that would be hugely effective. They don't have to speak all those languages, but some training about multilingual classrooms, I think, would be very beneficial.
So, thank you very much, Kerttu, thank you very much, Theo, and thank you for audience.